AMD's Polaris range is almost legendary at this point, but we've only ever taken a look at the 8GB version of the cards, so it's time to find out today. Are the 4GB ones still hanging in there, or are they completely obsolete? Right, so with the cost of absolutely everything going through the roof, RAM, graphics cards, virtually everything's gone up. It turns out the RX480 4GB, that's right, the small VRAM one, has actually become one of the most popular graphics cards across the December period. I never really thought to look at one, but in one of these boxes, because both boxes arrived at once, is an RX480 4GB that I ordered from CEX. It cost about £30. I just needed a graphics card for a project and I noticed it on there. I thought, well, that's not terrible value, and it gives us a chance to look at it to find out, are they obsolete? But let's get these open and find the actual RX480. I won't say it's not this one. Well, on the topic of everything going up in price, this was the last of the cheap RAM I was able to get. Now I feel like I'm showing off because I was getting 8 gigs for £5 a stick, and I managed to get these before they're all gone. So yeah, this was a full 32 gig set of Corsair RAM, so 20 quid for 32 gigs, which is a bargain in itself, but that's not what today's video is about. So if that was my RAM order, that means this, which has come from the Isle of Man, is the RX480. So let's see, just what does a 30 quid RX480 actually get you? Some packaging. But yeah, it's a bit of a weird one, these. One, because I don't actually know what version we've got. It could be a reference model, it could be an actual cool version. Oh, it's a MSI version, which has still got the warranty sticker on it, so still running the original thermal paste. We'll check if that's an issue with the thermals later. It's not a bad card for 30 quid, it's just a shame about the VRAM, because where RAM's gone up in price, people think VRAM should also go up in price as well, so the cost of RX480, RX580, GTX 1060s, all the higher VRAM variants that were becoming so cheap earlier on in the year, are now going up in price to the stage where these lower VRAM variants are the best sellers. We saw it a couple of weeks ago with the GTX 1060 with some okay results. These are still remarkably cheap though, to be fair, for 30 quid. It's a graphics card that needs one 8-pin. Really? Yeah, it just needs one 8-pin, that's all it actually needs. I mean, it should be able to do something. At least I've actually got the data from an 8GB card to see how much it's falling behind. So this is interesting, and for a couple of reasons. One, because PC parts are going through the roof, and two, was it a better idea to buy the 8GB card back in the day? Have these aged that much worse? Let's find out. Just go with a normal Ryzen desktop. I suppose we'll start with 1080p, and if we need to do some 1440p bits, we can always plug one in. It is a nice card, this MSI one. It's nicer than the reference model that we were able to get off eBay for the same price. I'm curious if there's any power efficiency differences between the 8GB and the 4GB. I mean, to be fair, if there are any differences, it's probably going to be down to manufacturer rather than the actual graphics card itself. But still, it'd be interesting to see how it performs out of the box, and to find out if the 4GB version is obsolete, because all the comments I got on my last video on the RX series, the reason it's so good is because you got the 8GB. Well, maybe there's a chance it was just down to the fact they were good cards. Maybe the 8GB doesn't actually do much. I think it probably does, but at the same time, it's something worth keeping in mind. Nice not to be using a VGA cable today. Does this fancy turning on and giving us a signal. I'm hoping, being a non-reference model, this probably hasn't been mined on. I haven't had many duds from CEX recently, but you never know. Back in the day I used to get plenty. I think they do test a little bit more now. For some reason these Polaris cards, when you first plug them in, they take a few seconds before they actually get recognised. I don't think we're running any drivers for this at the moment, so I'll probably need to download some. I will do some more testing with modded drivers at the end of the video, but once again, modded drivers do exist. Some people love them, some people don't see much point in them. Personally, to me, the modded drivers are mostly mediocre unless you're playing Counter-Strike, or GTA Online mostly is what we found. RX480, it's an MSI version, 4 gigs, GDDR5, a 9-year-old graphics card these days. There's not really too much setting up to do. We'll do a little bit of undervolting just to see if we get a performance difference. But yeah, as I was saying, these things are going for about £30, and if you look at the eBay auctions, there's very little price difference between the 4GB or the 8GB. Over on CEX and people just doing buy it now options, well, the price of the 8GB has shot up a little bit. I doubt auctions are going to follow that trend because people on auctions tend to be a little bit more savvy and know what they're willing to pay. But for people looking for a buy it now option, the 4GB version is remarkably better value than what the 8GB are selling for, both on CEX and on eBay. I've had a little look at international versions of eBay, similar case once again. The 4GB, people aren't asking stupid money for them, which is a positive, I suppose. I believe these are all on bug fixes. It doesn't matter if you've got a 4GB version or an 8GB version. It's all architecture based, so these are on the same support line as AMD's Vega, which, to be fair, we had a pretty good time using the Vega card. Run it through 3D Mark, get a baseline score. I can't imagine there's actually going to be too much of a difference in score between this and the full fat 8GB version. And then we'll try a bit of an undervolt. Being an aftermarket card, we might actually be able to do more with it. I doubt there's a huge deal of wiggle room. Polaris never had much wiggle room from my memory. I mean, it has got to be said, this architecture did carry these cards. 2304 unified shaders, 4GB of memory, actually a decent chunk of bandwidth there. We're running the latest version of the drivers we can. Temperatures are actually decent. 28 degrees at idle, we'll double check that through a benchmark. But honestly, even on the original thermal paste, this card may actually be fine. Performance is looking alright. Interesting to get an idea on temperature overall. The card's not really even put its fans on yet. Frame pacing isn't fantastic, but it's better than the reference model was out of the box. So I wouldn't be surprised if they have done some degree of tweaking on these cards to make them slightly more power efficient. Well, if not power efficient, at least they've fixed the throttling issue they've got with clocks. We'll find out in a minute afterwards when the benchmarks run through, so we'll run through Time Spy. Currently, it looks all good. At least, well, we're not hitting any memory thresholds now, so performance should be all fine. But it is better than a reference model out the box, which is something. I mean, it's potluck what card you actually get from CEX, so you could end up with one like this, you could end up with reference, you could end up with one better. You don't know until it arrives. Well, performance out of the box for the RX480, even being the 4GB version. Keep in mind we aren't hitting any VRAM limits yet. Well, one, this MSI card is at least able to keep its clock somewhat in order. Is it getting hot at all? No, it's topping out at 64 degrees. That's actually a really good result. I wasn't expecting that level of good. Let's take a little look at the voltages real quick. I am curious. I mean, in reality, when we actually get to the gaming benchmarks, that's when this is all going to make sense and we actually get to see the real difference. We'll just go through, we'll test our own little undervolt. We'll just throw one together. If we say, to be fair, Polaris is remarkably efficient. My little prediction here is that I think the card's going to work fine. I mean, it's nothing too exciting a video. We've ordered the RX480 4GB. We want to know if it's obsolete. Out of the box, it works okay. It does need some undervolting, of which that took me 30 seconds to do. I didn't even bother having a benchmark open. It's pretty much the same for all of these AMD cards. And now we'll run it through 3D Mark, get some results, do some comparisons to other cards, and I think we're all good to go with the rest of the video. Now, when it came to the undervolting process of this MSI card, it did need a little bit more work than the standard reference model because they've set the boost clocks higher. Generally, it's the exact same process, but given how aggressively this card just constantly wanted to boost up, I did hear about this at the time that some of the manufacturers were really trying to eke out as much extra performance as they could. And to be fair, the way they've set it up out of the box with these performance profiles isn't too bad. That is, unless of course you care about power consumption. I do have some figures later on in the video, but they seem to have sorted out the issues I had with the reference model, which is where the boost clocks can't be achieved, so you get odd stuttering and pacing problems that just aren't here on this MSI card out of the box. So credit to them for doing that. But they've done it by allowing the card to use almost obscene amounts of power. Trust me, I do have all the readings and graphs later, but we did go through, managed to get a little bit of an undervolt on there. It was still hitting the same boost clocks that MSI had set the card to, but it meant that we managed to get an ever so slightly higher score, while also achieving lower power consumption, which is one of the main benefits you get out of these Polaris cards anyway. And just what does this undervolt achieve? Well, primarily in the case of this card, it was purely to bring down the power consumption. The performance we got out of the box was pretty much perfect. There weren't all too many issues with it. I just wanted to see if there was anything we could actually do to maybe make the card just run a little bit better. When you actually look at the graphs, by them side by side, with a reference model undervolted, this model stock, and then this version also undervolted, there is virtually no difference in score whatsoever between them. I mean, genuinely, it was 4195 for the reference model when it was undervolted, and this MSI version undervolted was 4211. So you're talking under 30 points difference. Genuinely, the only way that I can actually show this on a graph to make it actually look like something is to make it a very Nvidia-style graph. But let's be honest, there is no performance difference between any of these cards or the stock version. They all perform within a margin of each other, and all benefit from being undervolted. In terms of comparisons to other cards, it performs very similar to the RX480, makes sense, it's the same card. A GTX 1060 running an overclock is slightly better, but a stock GTX 1060 is worse, and it gives you an idea how this card places. Out of the box, when you're not factoring in VRAM amounts, this card performs like an RX480, which in itself is the RX580, and in most ways is also an RX590. I'm not going to go off on that tangent again this video. The point being, there's plenty of power there, and you should tweak these cards, but honestly, it does look like MSI and probably some of the other add-in board partners have actually managed to sort out most of the issues other than power consumption. We're not going to spend much time talking about the specifications of the RX480 because, let's be honest, if you want to find out in more detail, go back and watch the RX580 or the original RX480 videos, because the only difference in specifications is the VRAM. Genuinely, it's the exact same VRAM, it's just cut down to 4GB on these cheaper cards. It utilises a GCN4 based architecture, which is a Polaris 10 XT variant, 4GB of GDDR5 running through a 256-bit memory bus. Driver-wise, you still receive some bug fixes from AMD, or there are modded drivers available, and I've done some testing later on in the video just to show the performance difference. You have 2,304 cores, 144 TMUs, 32 ROPs, full support for DirectX 12 and Vulkan, and power consumption generally sits between 150 and 190 watts, much lower to the 150 level mark when you actually undervolt the card and let it run properly. With all that being said though, this card does find itself in an interesting place in the market, where when people are looking for these cards, well, the 4GB version is often the cheapest buy it now version. I mean, that's why I've ended up with it, because I needed a card now, and it was available for £30 with a 5-year warranty, which isn't too bad. The thing is, when we talk about this card, lots of people are willing to say they're obsolete because of that cut down amount of VRAM, and I'd be inclined to agree if we hadn't just seen the GTX 1060 3GB, which has less power than this and a whole, well, 1 whole gigabyte less VRAM, do absolutely fine. Now, of course, we do have results to compare to with the full-fat 8GB version later on, but the reality of performance here mostly seems to be that this is an RX480, and we want to know how much does that 4GB hold it back. And the only way to find out just how much the 4GB is holding it back is with the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, just to really stress out the card, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition running with the very high preset, plus HBAO enabled. And you're probably wondering, why are we doing this in a 1440p resolution? Well, once again, 1080p in this game just wasn't enough to actually stress out the card, or really limit the VRAM on the card, to be honest. GTA 5 Enhanced, much like the Legacy version, tends to be a tad pessimistic when talking about VRAM in the settings menu, as if you actually monitor it, even on cards that have a larger VRAM pool than this, it tends to actually not use anywhere near as much as it says it wants to. But still, we did notice that there was some performance deficits compared to the 8GB card, more on that later, but the overall experience, even stressing this card out in 1440p, returned us with a fully playable experience with 46 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 37 FPS. For most people, this would be a 1080p card, and I can safely tell you, it pretty much spends all of its time over 60 FPS at lower resolutions. The Legacy version of GTA 5 did actually run better, and this was likely because it is using less VRAM. Already we are noticing that the card can still do it, but the VRAM is definitely a limiting factor, especially when you start pushing these higher resolutions. We still ran the game with very high settings and AMD CHS shadows, and returned 58 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 51 FPS. To try and really stress out the card and the VRAM on it, I did turn up some of the options in the advanced settings just to give us that ability to say we ran the game with very high options, and it does include some details like when you're flying it tries to stream in higher resolution assets, and of course that does tend to fill up the VRAM even on cards from back in the day. So here, when we are limited just 4GB, it did have a noticeable impact. But still, once again, probably most people want to be playing this at 1080p, and it does run even better there. When it comes to GTA Online, especially the legacy version, it does suffer with its poor optimizations over 16 players. So after spending enough time to actually eventually find a fully packed out lobby at the time of day I was testing, we returned 48 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 43 FPS. So remarkably good frame times, but our FPS does actually take a 10 FPS hit. It's still nothing too bad and actually better than I was expecting, and utilization on the card actually remained relatively high. It definitely suffered from the very standard GTA Online utilization problems, but at the end of the day, it was still fully playable, and the 4GB of VRAM wasn't causing all too much of a hindrance, as much as the actual netcode and how the optimization goes out the window in this version of the game does. Counter-Strike 2 was an interesting one because I wanted to see how the game would play with the settings that most people are using. They're using competitive settings in a 1080p, sometimes a higher resolution, but often a high refresh rate 1080p monitor. And how does it perform? Well, during the built-in benchmark, we saw 213 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 150 FPS. Which is more or less the same, if not within margin, of how the game worked on the 8GB card. Genuinely, I think it was about 1 FPS increase in average, and a few frames lost as 1% lows. Makes sense, it's got lower VRAM amounts, and maybe it could pull over that slightly, but I really doubt it with these types of settings. Now, higher settings would have an impact on performance, but then again, you're dealing with a lower VRAM version of the card, of course it's going to. For the settings that people actually want to play though, it was a competitive experience, and throughout bigger maps and newer maps, the performance was pretty much also the same. So for Counter-Strike 2, it's still a good esports card, and I don't think anyone can hold that against it. With BeamNG, we ran the game with the high preset in 1080p, and we returned 44 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 38 FPS. Now, something to note that does vary between the 4GB version of the card and the full-fat 8GB version is the game would take a little while longer to settle down with these types of settings, and 1080p really was as high as you could go resolution-wise. You could probably turn some of the effects off and go up to 1440p, but honestly, if you're buying this card, really, why would you? At the end of the day, once the game had settled down and the frame rates calmed down, our frame times were remarkably smooth and the game did look and run pretty much perfectly, even in the most intensive of situations. It's worth noting that changing maps or actually reloading to new areas wouldn't cause the frame rate to start spiking around again like it can do on some cards, but it would still be pretty present a lot of the time when you launch the game into these more intense areas. It usually took only a couple of minutes to calm down, but it's still something that happened. Cyberpunk 2077 had me curious because it did actually run pretty well for us on the 8GB versions of these cards. But here, how would it fare with the 4GB version? While running the game with low textures and medium and high settings to actually give us something to look at in a 1080p resolution, we returned about 30 to 40 FPS during the built-in benchmark. But does this actually translate well into real-world gameplay performance? Well, during our usual stress test, we saw an average of 37 FPS, with 1% lows down to 31 FPS, which definitely did indicate that the VRAM was taking a pelting. It pretty much stayed at its maximum level throughout the entire time we were trying to run the game, but still, Cyberpunk 2077 worked very well. You're probably better off capping the frame rate at 30 FPS, but you are losing out on some performance because of that lacking VRAM. But still, it's playable, and if you're capping the game at 30 FPS, it wouldn't matter if you got the 8GB or the 4GB, you're going to get the same experience. To move things even more forward into the modern day just to see how this card does struggle, we have Oblivion Remastered, and this really is the turning point. Unreal Engine 5 games, at least the ones that suffer with, you know what, there's no point beating around the bush, just crap optimization like Oblivion Remastered here, we were able to run the game with low settings plus screen space reflections in 810p. This returns an average of 30 FPS that we had to achieve by capping the game externally because the built-in cap doesn't work very well and has frame pacing problems, but we did at least see the game run pretty good with these settings. It didn't look too bad and there were some odd effects going on with the screen space reflections, but at the end of the day we did manage to get it playable. But this does show the clear difference between the 4GB and the 8GB version. The main issue being, well, we were able to run it with 1080p and actual settings turned on, and here with the 4GB version, the card's got the power, But unfortunately, due to the lackluster optimizations of this game, well, you're going to have to cap the frame rate at 30 FPS and stick to all low settings and a lower resolution just to keep the game playable. Doesn't sound quite right, does it? Moving back to older Bethesda games though, Fallout 4 is a popular one because we can never be sure how it's going to run. Although it has got to be said, given the last few updates of this game, it does actually benefit from modern hardware. I don't know if I can really call this modern hardware, but compared to what I usually try and run this game on, we're going to run with it. We still actually returned a fairly okay frame rate with the game defaulting to a mixture of high and ultra settings, and we saw the game run at 59 FPS on average. Well, most of the time it was 60 FPS, there were just occasional moments when lots was on screen, where occasionally it would drop down to the mid-50s. For most of the actual time playing Fallout 4 though, it achieved a pretty much locked and consistent 60 FPS. Yes, the card was getting pretty much full utilization here, it was really working hard, but still, Fallout 4 worked fine. I never thought I'd say that Fallout 4 is actually a good example of a game, but for once, here it is. How does the card handle PUBG though? Well, going too much higher than medium and high settings with DirectX 12 would result in the game stuttering quite a lot. The maximum I was able to go up to was a mixture of medium and high settings in 1080p, and that saw the game run pretty much fine on the card. But once again, it does show the VRAM is limiting, but then again, as long as you don't mind turning down a few options to medium, it's still hanging in there, and this game is still very popular. We saw 71 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 49 FPS, which would eventually stabilise quite quickly, to be honest. Once you're actually on the ground, within about 30 seconds the frame rate had stabilised where it needed to be. I did try dropping the game down to low, and it still does that. This just seems to be a PUBG thing. Utilising DirectX 11 makes it worse, so this is about the best experience you're going to get on the card. It's still very playable, and hey, for a 30 quid graphics card that'll fit in most systems, it's not really the worst deal, is it? Red Dead Redemption 2 is a nightmare on lower VRAM cards in even 4GB. Even 4GB in a game like this, the game just constantly says, oh, you've exceeded your VRAM limit, you've exceeded your VRAM limit, and you can't choose to ignore it like you can with other Rockstar titles. So in the end, it optimized itself. I just let it run with these settings. It was a weird mixture of medium and ultra using DirectX 12 in 1080p. For some reason, the game decided, nope, that's how it's running today, so we're just running with it because otherwise I'd be here tweaking INI files for ages. We saw 56 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 47 FPS. Overall, Red Dead probably made the right choice on settings. I don't know why it wanted textures on Ultra, especially on a 4GB card. That's just something it wanted to do. But still, it ran okay, frame time seemed alright, and the game was playable. So I'm not really complaining, but I'd probably, if I was going to play this game on this card, tweak the settings around myself in the config file. This is one that is always requested on the channel with Rust, which we ran with the medium preset in 1080p. It ran with 43 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 38 FPS in a combination of both an actual active server with people on it and the game's rather comprehensive built-in benchmark. So I'm pretty confident these are the kind of results you get throughout your entire time playing. The worst frame rate I think we saw overall was 31 FPS when lots was going on, so although being a quite limited card with just 4GB, as long as you don't mind medium settings in Rust, I don't think we've actually tested it with any settings higher than this to be honest on the channel, it runs pretty good and you can get away with it. Mountain Blade Bannerlord, I just let the game use its auto-detect feature because it seems to be very good at deciding the settings to use, and it configured itself to a mixture of high and very high settings in 1080p. This returned 72 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 52 FPS, which was notably lower than it was on the 8GB card during the flyover sequence when there's lots of soldiers on screen. Makes sense, we've got half the VRAM, and this is very reminiscent of a late stage battle. For most of the actual gameplay though, this card pretty much ran the exact same as its 8GB variant, although turning the game up to higher resolutions is not exactly something I'm going to recommend to do here, because it could make some of those stutters just a little bit worse. At the end of the day, Bannerlord was playable, and for a card that can run the game at 1080p quite well, there doesn't seem to be too much of a difference between this and the 8GB version. How does the card fare with older titles though? Well, most old titles don't really use much VRAM, so they run exactly the same on both cards, 4GB, 8GB. In fact, newer versions like the RX480 or 590, they'll all return a very similar frame rate to this at the end of the day. Tomb Raider with ultimate settings in 1080p return 102 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 88 FPS. And it will be the same for virtually all games of this era, or anything from this sort of age, where you can quite comfortably max them out and achieve frame rates that are between 60 and 100 FPS. So yeah, for those older classic titles, where VRAM doesn't really matter, well, these RX580s, even the 4GB versions, are a little bit of a bargain to get into gaming in this territory, where you can feel like you've got a flagship when you really don't need one. Given its recent surge up in popularity, Hitman ran very well with high settings and the best simulation options also enabled in the 1080p resolution. We're utilising the more intensive Dartmoor benchmark map and returned 60 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 55 FPS. Once again, this is one of those games that sort of knows exactly what settings it wants to use on each card, and it detected the settings that would get us 60 FPS, so I just let the game run with exactly those settings. We didn't exactly have any problems whatsoever, there weren't any stutters, frame drops. I mean, it worked pretty much perfectly, so Hitman, well, seems to work pretty good on a 4GB version of the card. I did check if there was anything like VSync enabled, and there wasn't. It just really did run at around the 60 FPS figure. But can it run Crysis? Well, given Crysis at these resolutions doesn't really actually use that much VRAM, despite looking absolutely great by the way, it does run perfectly fine, so even the 4GB version of the RX580 can handle Crysis without all too many problems. Fortunately, it still has drivers that let it run the DirectX 10 version, very boring point, but a point I have to make now because some graphics cards can't launch the game in this mode, and it was running with ultra settings. So yes, Crysis works perfectly fine on the RX580, and I don't think there was any performance difference between this and an 8GB version. You could argue that it actually ran probably 1 or 2 frames quicker, but that's probably because it's an MSI aftermarket version rather than being, I don't know, what was the version we had before, the stock AMD Sapphire reference version? So, the RX480 4GB model, and what are my thoughts about the performance as a standalone card? Well, at the end of the day, this is a card that cost me £30, it comes with a warranty and it works fine, and I don't think you can really argue with the performance that we got, that for 30 quid, it's more than enough to get you by. And this is going to be a graphics card in a computer that is going to be plenty powerful, the types of things they want to run on it. So it definitely still has a purpose out there. I think some of the standouts were the fact that it runs Cyberpunk 2077 without all too many problems, popular titles like GTA 5, I mean it's going to be very similar to what I said about the 1063GB. For the games that people are actually playing out there, so like the actual games people want to sit down and play, it's perfect. It runs them fine. It shouldn't come as a surprise that this, along with the 1063GB, are still so popular in parts of the world that developers have to at least consider them as a minimum. And they almost still are, unless you're looking at some bloated, unoptimized Unreal Engine 5 title that doesn't work on anything unless you've got a 4090. The reality is that most games that have a degree of thought put into their optimization process work fine on these cards still. But that doesn't necessarily mean this card's great when the 8GB versions of it can be nabbed for similar money. At least I was able to get an 8GB version for the same price I paid for this, but I had to take a chance on mine on an auction. But the thing is though, how does this card actually compare to the full-fat 8GB version of the card? And well, there were a few notable instances where there was no performance change. For example, running Counter-Strike on either of these cards, if you're running the game with the settings that most people are using, there is no performance difference between the 4GB or the 8GB version of the card. And it does make sense that that's the case because, of course, you're not using over that 4GB of VRAM. The main difference, though, is brand new titles, and I don't think anyone can really question it. Oblivion Remastered on the 8GB version of the card, we managed to achieve around 38 FPS on average during built-up areas or when we're out adventuring with a mixture of low and medium settings in a full-fat 1080p resolution. Here, on the 4GB version, we were having to have everything on low and drop the resolution away from 1080p, and it did look noticeably worse. So yeah, when it comes to brand new titles, those 8GB are going to help. But for the vast majority of games people are actually playing, well, they're playable on both cards. Yes, the 8GB version will allow you to play them in 1440p, which is something that I really wouldn't recommend with the 4GB version, but when you actually go through and compare the actual details between them, well, unless you're playing something in 1440p or with ultra-high settings, which at that point the card itself can't even manage, well, you know, it's a weird one, isn't it? Objectively, get an 8GB version of the card. It's got better longevity. In titles like GTA 5, you can play it in a higher resolution, and you can enjoy 60 FPS, whereas you have to drop it down to 1080p here to enjoy it at 60 FPS. The thing is, though, if it's the only card available to you, well, people are going to tell you, get the 8GB version, the 4GB one's useless. It really isn't. It's a good card for 1080p, and it's only when you start turning up settings, which is something that even Polaris is struggling to do in power alone, lacking when you even ignore VRAM. I'm going off a bit of a tangent here, but I hope that point's making sense. It's an okay card still, especially for esports titles, and when you're utilising the settings most people are, well, 4GB of VRAM isn't so much a problem as much as it is lacking power on the card. It's only brand new, unoptimised VRAM heavy titles like Oblivion Remastered and the Unreal Engine mess that are going to start causing you issues. To refer back to earlier in the video, I did say that MSI had mostly managed to fix some of the weird issues that happen on Polaris cards, which causes issues with frame pacing due to the boost clocks not staying exactly where they should. And for the most part, this card does seem to work fine out of the box, but how have they managed to do this? Well, the card now consumes 188 watts of power, which is quite a lot more than the competing GTX 1060 cards this was up against was actually doing. Now, it does undervolt to a more comfortable 152 watts, which can be lower than this while gaming. Keep in mind most of these figures are taken from Furmark, and of course the AMD reference model was using around 118 watts because I think we must have got a golden version there that seemed to undervolt like crazy. Although one of the tests that people always love to see, and I love doing now actually, is just how low can we go in terms of power consumption on these cards. Well, I managed to run GTA 5 Enhanced Edition with the high preset in a full HD 1080p resolution and achieved nearly full 60 FPS by just using 55 watts. Genuinely, the card ran dead cold. In fact, to be fair, the card's thermals are excellent. This MSI version, the fans hardly ever rev up, if at all, to be honest, and it is just a huge improvement over the reference design. But in terms of power consumption, the Polaris architecture is still remarkably efficient and can achieve decent gameplay at even just 55 watts. I will sneak a small section in here and say that AMD VCE does work on the card. If you want to see a test of that, go back and watch either the RX480 or RX480 videos, because the quality will be the exact same. What matters here, though, is please undervolt your cards, because otherwise you are just utilising power that doesn't need to be used. When it comes to modded drivers, they do work on the card, and in terms of performance, well, it was nothing out of the ordinary. It's about what we'd expect from modded drivers. The card shows up as an RX590X, which I don't ever think was a real card from AMD, but according to the modded drivers it is, and they installed without any problems. It makes absolutely no difference to having 4GB of VRAM on the card. You don't get any additional performance benefit. It's not exactly doing anything special there. What you do see is a slight increase in performance in mostly Counter-Strike 2 and GTA Online. A couple other multiplayer titles do increase the frame rate slightly, and generally legacy titles and older classic single-player titles do suffer, some quite dramatically in the case of games like Tomb Raider, which did perform noticeably worse, still not too badly though. At the end of the day, these modded drivers are primarily for people looking to do competitive gaming on these older cards, so if that is something you're interested in, well, these modded drivers do in fact help. I'm not going to talk about them too much more because that's all there really is to them, and that seems to be the case across virtually all cards we've tested, AMD Vega included. I'm sure maybe at some point there'll be some difference, but we're not near enough into the future yet for it to have sort of taken hold. So there we have it, the AMD RX480 4GB version. And I think I've got my thoughts together pretty good on this one, because maybe what I'm going to say is controversial. I genuinely think that PC parts are going to be in for a big rise in price in 2026. And I think people are going to come back and look at this video, because this is going to be one of the few cards they can find on the market, and will go, that's good enough. And it pains me to say this, because we've picked up an RX580 8GB for £22, we picked up an 8GB RX480 for the same price as this, so it seems odd that I'm praising this card which is objectively worse than both of those, and it's costing the same price, if not more. But I think prices are in for a big shift, and I think with the way that RAM prices are going, cards with higher VRAM pools are going to go the same way, because as we've seen, new titles that are mostly, I don't really want to call Unreal Engine 5 titles bloated slop, because not all of them are, but the vast majority of them I've tested are VRAM hogs, and they're resource hogs, and they will refuse to run right, even on a card like this that, as we know, has got plenty of power, but it doesn't have the VRAM that the engine requires, so it doesn't run well. And as more and more people want to play those titles, well, these higher VRAM cards will probably go up in price, leaving you with these 4GB versions of the card. And I think it is good enough. I don't want to be too pessimistic, because that hasn't happened just yet, but even monitoring the prices week on week at the moment, where I've been building a lot of computers over the Christmas period, graphics cards are going up in price. And it is a little bit scary, because I don't know where it's going to stop. I don't know what's going to happen. At the end of the day, this card's good enough for what I need it for, and I think that's the conclusion we're going to go with. Get an 8GB version if you can, because it's free performance in newer titles, but for the vast majority of people that just want something that'll do the job, well, the RX480 4GB still gets it done. So thank you all very much for watching, and good night.